The laughter around the table wasn't just cruel, it was meant to break me. I still remember how the sound echoed in that ballroom, sharp and glittering like the chandeliers above, cutting through me with every chuckle and smirk. It was the kind of laughter that doesn't stay contained at the table. It spreads, bounces off the polished marble walls. It makes you feel like the whole world is laughing at you. That night, in that moment, I knew what it felt like to be reduced to nothing in front of people who claimed to be my peers. When I first walked into the hotel, I told myself it was an honor to be there. Only senior staff and rising stars were invited to these quarterly corporate dinners, and being chosen meant recognition. It meant I was finally visible in a company where visibility was rare. I'd worked late nights, turned in flawless presentations, volunteered for projects no one else wanted, and stayed invisible long enough to avoid mistakes. When the email arrived with my name on the guest list, I thought I was finally being seen for the right reasons. I couldn't afford a designer gown like most of the women who would be attending. Instead, I chose something that mattered more to me than any brand label could. My dress had been my mother's, a deep navy blue, modest and timeless, with delicate hand-stitched embroidery at the neckline. She had worn it to her first job interview after immigrating to America. For her, that dress represented courage. For me, it represented her. Every time I slipped it on, I felt her presence, like her strength was stitched into the seams. As the car pulled up to the glowing entrance of the hotel, I smoothed the fabric nervously and whispered to myself that I belonged, that I had earned this, that my mother's dress was not a weakness but a badge of honor. The ballroom was a cathedral of excess. Golden light cascaded from massive chandeliers, crystal glasses sparkled on white linen tables, and the air hummed with the subtle clinking of cutlery against porcelain. Waiters glided silently between tables with silver trays balanced effortlessly on one hand. Conversations drifted like perfume, stock market whispers, vacation homes, designer handbags, wine vintages. It was a world of wealth and privilege, and though I had been clawing my way closer to it for years, I still felt like an imposter in its glittering halls. I found my seat toward always does when the most powerful man in the room arrives. Chad Whitmore, our CEO, entered late. Always late. He liked the effect of it, the way conversations died down and heads turned as he strode in, sharp-jawed and commanding, as if the night had been waiting for him. His presence was magnetic, and not in the way that warms you. No, his presence was the kind that makes you sit straighter, watch your words, and guard your every expression. He was the kind of man who thrived on control, and control often came at the expense of someone else's dignity. I had seen him do it before, turn a casual comment into a weapon, mock an employee's idea until it shriveled into nothing, reduce someone to silence with a single joke that wasn't funny but drew enough laughter to sting. He liked targets, and that night he chose me. It started with a glance. His eyes swept the table, assessing, measuring, calculating. When they landed on me, my stomach dropped. I had prayed to stay invisible, but invisibility is not what Chad allowed. He tilted his head, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips, the kind of smile that never meant kindness. "So," he said loudly, his voice booming enough to cut through the chatter, "did anyone notice Emily Carter's interesting wardrobe choice tonight?" The words slammed into me like a punch. My chest tightened, my breath caught. My first instinct was to pretend I hadn't heard him, but the sudden silence told me everyone had. Dozens of eyes turned toward me, flickering down to my dress, curious, judgmental, amused. Chad let the pause stretch, savoring it. He swirled the wine in his glass, leaning back in his chair with the casual arrogance of a man who knew the room belonged to him. Then, with a chuckle, he delivered the blow. "It's quaint, isn't it? Almost like something out of a thrift store. Reminds me of my grandmother's curtains." Laughter erupted. Not from everyone, not all at once, but enough. Enough to make my ears burn and my stomach twist. Some people laughed too quickly, eager to prove loyalty. Others forced out chuckles, uncomfortable but unwilling to risk his disapproval. A few stayed silent, but silence in a moment like that isn't protection. its complicity.
Tears, and my chest felt like it might cave in. Around me, forks clinked, glasses tilted, conversations resumed with a thin veneer of normalcy, but nothing was normal for me. I wasn't a guest anymore. I wasn't a professional. I wasn't even a person. I was a punchline, a story to be retold later for amusement. And the worst part, for a fleeting moment, I believed him. I believed that maybe I didn't belong in that room, that maybe my dress did make me small, that maybe I was nothing more than the thrift store girl he painted me to be. Humiliation is dangerous like that. It doesn't just wound you from the outside. It seeps in, festers, and makes you doubt everything you are. I wanted to run, to vanish, to slip out the side door and never come back. But I stayed rooted to my chair, paralyzed by shame, praying no one could see the tremor in my hands beneath the table. The dinner continued around me, as though my humiliation was just another form of entertainment before the next course. But inside, something was breaking. I forced myself to breathe, to swallow the shame like poison, to remind myself that this moment wouldn't define me. Yet the laughter echoed still, ringing louder than the clinking glasses and murmured conversations. I could feel my dignity scattered across the tablecloth like crumbs no one bothered to sweep away. And then, just as I thought the night couldn't cut any deeper, I felt it. A gaze. Not mocking, not pitying. Something else. Slowly, I lifted my eyes, still blurred with unshed tears. Across the table, past the silverware and wine glasses, someone was watching me. His face was unreadable, but his eyes held steady on mine. Not with cruelty, not with amusement, but with something different. Something I hadn't felt all night. He wasn't laughing. But just as I lowered my gaze, I saw someone else at the table watching me, and he wasn't laughing. Sometimes the smallest glance can feel like a lifeline. After the laughter, after the sting of my boss's words still burned hot on my skin, I thought I was completely alone at that table. My humiliation had become the evening's centerpiece, and no amount of silverware clinking or polite chatter could bury the sound of it. My hands trembled beneath the table, hidden in my lap, and I told myself to stay still, stay quiet, stay invisible. That had always been my survival strategy. But then I lifted my eyes. Across the lobby, the others. And that difference. It was enough to make me breathe again. His name, though I didn't know it then, was Daniel Blake. The man who owned the very luxury brand most of the guests in that room were draped in. The man whose signature could make or break reputations in fashion and business alike. I would only learn later how much weight his presence carried. In that moment, though, I only knew him as the man who hadn't laughed. He was dressed in a charcoal suit, not flashy, not ostentatious, but cut so perfectly it moved with him like a second skin. His dark hair was threaded with hints of silver, his posture effortlessly straight, his demeanor calm in a way that made the entire table's restless energy feel childish by comparison. He wasn't trying to dominate the room with noise or bravado. He didn't need to. His very composure commanded attention. The contrast was stark. While Chad Whitmore basked in his own cruelty, swirling his wine like it was a crown in his hand, Daniel Blake sat quietly, watching, waiting, saying nothing. And somehow, that silence was louder than the laughter. It was the smallest thing at first, a subtle shift in the air, a weight that settled differently once his gaze lingered. Guests who had laughed a little too loudly began to notice him, their chuckles tapering off, their posture straightening as if to align with his calm. They couldn't name why, but they felt it. His quiet disapproval was reshaping the room. For me, it was like oxygen. After drowning in humiliation, that glance was a gasp of air I hadn't realized I was desperate for. My cheeks still burned, my stomach still twisted, but the tight coil of despair inside me loosened just slightly. I pressed my palm against the embroidery at my neckline, grounding myself in the stitches my mother had sewn. And for the first time since Chad's words cut through the air, I didn't feel quite so small. Daniel didn't speak, not yet. But he didn't have to. Every detail of his body language spoke for him. The way his hand rested loosely on the stem of his glass, steady and deliberate. The way his shoulders squared, unflinching, unbothered by Chad's theatrics. The way his eyes, sharp but not unkind, held Chad's smirk in quiet defiance. and that wasn't as strong as their instinct to follow power. And even in silence, Daniel radiated it. I noticed the change immediately. The shift wasn't dramatic, it was subtle. The way tension can leave a room molecule by molecule. But it was enough to let me feel a flicker of hope. Maybe I wasn't completely alone. Maybe not everyone at this table was willing to let me bleed for Chad's amusement. My eyes drifted back to Daniel, searching for answers in his calm expression. Did he know me? Was he simply being decent? Or was this something else? A man's quiet refusal to laugh at cruelty, even when it was the easier choice. Whatever the reason, his silence became my shield. Chad noticed it too. Of course he did. A man like Chad was always hyper-aware of threats to his dominance. His smirk twitched, faltering for just a moment before he recovered. He leaned back, his tone sharper now, his voice louder, as though volume could reclaim what silence had stolen. "Come on, everyone," he said, forcing another laugh. "Don't be so serious. It was just a little joke." But the joke had already soured. The energy wasn't the same anymore. A few guests chuckled politely, but the sound was thinner, weaker, lacking the bite it had before. And every time someone's eyes flicked toward Daniel, they grew quieter still. I sat frozen, still too raw to speak. But inside me, something shifted. For so long, I had lived by the rules of people like Chad. Stay small, stay quiet, accept humiliation as part of survival. But Daniel's quiet defiance cracked those rules just enough to let me glimpse something different. A possibility. It was almost unbearable to sit there, between shame and hope, wondering if his silence would grow into something more. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might shake the glass in front of me. Every second stretched thin. The clatter of cutlery and murmur of conversation around us a flimsy cover for the storm building beneath the surface. And then it happened. Daniel shifted. He set his glass down fully this time, his fingers leaving the stem. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, like a man preparing to swallow everything whole. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The chandeliers gleamed above us, their golden light spilling over the table like liquid fire. But all eyes were fixed on the man who had dared to break the unspoken rule of the evening. You do not stand against Chad Whitmore. Not here. Not now. Not ever. Daniel didn't rush. He rose slowly, shoulders squared, posture tall but not arrogant. He adjusted his cufflink with a deliberate calm that made the pause stretch unbearably long. Then, without so much as a glance at the stunned faces around him, he placed both hands lightly on the back of his chair and spoke. "Mr. Whitmore," he began, his voice deep and steady, carrying effortlessly to the far corners of the ballroom. "That wasn't a joke. That was cruelty." The words landed like thunder. I felt them in my chest before I even processed their meaning. No one spoke to Chad like that. No one even suggested he might be wrong, much less accused him of cruelty in front of an entire room. My breath caught in my throat, disbelief flooding through me. Did he really just say that? Chad's smirk faltered, the arrogance in his expression tightening into something sharper, colder. He leaned back in his chair as though unimpressed, but the tension in his jaw betrayed him. Around the table, guests shifted uneasily, their eyes darting between the two men like spectators at the start of a duel. I sat frozen, unable to tear my gaze away from Daniel. Gratitude swelled in me so quickly it was almost overwhelming. After years of swallowing humiliation, of learning how to shrink small enough to avoid it, someone had finally spoken. Not whispered in private, not offered hollow sympathy after the fact, but spoken out loud, in public, in the one space where cruelty usually went unchecked. For the first time that evening, the humiliation pressing down on me loosened its grip. It didn't vanish, the sting of Chad's words still lingered, but it shifted. The laughter that had drowned me moments ago was gone, replaced by a new weight. Disbelief, tension, and a thin thread of possibility.
Daniel didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His calmness was sharper than Chad's theatrics, his composure louder than mockery. Dignity itself, about refusing to let cruelty masquerade as charm. He had stripped away Chad's disguise in front of everyone, and for the first time, I saw cracks forming in the mask my boss always wore. Chad chuckled, but the sound was brittle, forced. "Cruelty?" he repeated, his tone dripping with mockery. "Daniel, surely you're not taking this so seriously. It was just lighthearted fun. Emily knows I didn't mean anything by it, don't you, Emily?" Every head turned toward me. My mouth went dry, my pulse surging. He wanted me to play along, to save him from the growing unease at the table. This was the trap. If I laughed it off, the humiliation would be cemented forever. If I contradicted him, the consequences would be brutal. I opened my mouth, but no words came. The room blurred around me, the chandeliers spinning slightly as my vision swam. I wanted to vanish, to disappear beneath the tablecloth, but before I could crumble beneath the weight of expectation, Daniel spoke again. "Don't put her in that position," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "We all heard what was said. We all saw the laughter. Don't insult us by pretending it was harmless." The relief that flooded through me was indescribable. He hadn't just defended me, he had protected me from the trap Chad had set. My gratitude surged like a tide, fierce and consuming. The room was still silent, but it wasn't the silence of complicity anymore. It was the silence of shock, of realization, of people grappling with the possibility that the man they had always followed might not be untouchable after all. Chad's smile was thin now, stretched taut across his face. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, trying to reclaim control. "You've always had a flair for dramatics, Daniel," he said lightly, though his voice carried an edge. "But I think you're misreading the situation. We're all friends here. Surely you don't think I intended harm." Daniel didn't blink. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he said. "And what I think is irrelevant. What matters is the truth that everyone in this room already feels." It was subtle, but I saw it. The way guests glanced down at their plates, avoiding Chad's eyes. The way their laughter had dried up completely, replaced by an uncomfortable quiet. "Then what does that say about the company we keep?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to dismiss them. No one did. I swallowed hard, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. For years I had told myself to endure, to stay silent, to bend rather than break. But Daniel had just shattered the rulebook in front of everyone. And though I didn't understand why he was doing it, I couldn't deny the impact. The power dynamic had shifted. It wasn't complete. Chad still had his authority, his influence, his grip on the room. But for the first time, that grip wasn't absolute. For the first time, I saw him unsettled. And for the first time, I felt the tiniest spark of power inside myself. But as I clung to that fragile spark, I realized something even more shocking. Daniel wasn't just speaking in generalities. His words weren't random. His defense wasn't vague. His phrasing, his tone, the way he spoke, it was as if he knew me. As if he knew my story, my background, my truth. And then, with a voice calm and steady, he said something that revealed he knew far more about me than I ever told anyone. The dress they mocked carried a story none of them were ready to hear. When Daniel Blake's words cut through the silence, the entire table leaned in, though no one dared to move. His voice was calm, but it carried the weight of authority. He wasn't just speaking as a man in a tailored suit. He was speaking as someone who understood things deeper than status, wealth, or appearances. He shifted his gaze from Chad to me, and for the first time that night, I felt like the spotlight wasn't a weapon. It was protection. "This dress," Daniel said, his hand gesturing lightly towards me, "isn't just fabric. It's not something pulled from a rack to impress strangers or flaunt wealth. I know craftsmanship when I see it. Those stitches weren't made by a machine. They were made by a hand that cared, a hand that knew patience, detail, and pride." A ripple moved through the guests. Heads turned towards me again, but the gaze was different this time. Not mocking, not cruel. Curious, almost respectful. Heat spilling across her tired hands. She worked nights at a sewing shop to keep food on the table. She'd come home smelling like fabric dye and dust, her fingers raw from stitching. And then, after everyone else went to bed, she'd sit at the little kitchen table and sew for us. Clothes, blankets, anything she could make stretch our money further. This dress, I glanced down, my hand pressed over my heart. This was one of her proudest creations. She wore it to her very first job interview here. She told me once that it made her feel strong, like she was worthy of the future she dreamed of. My voice trembled, but I forced myself to keep going. When she passed, she left it to me. She said, "Emily, when you wear this, you'll carry my courage. You'll remember that no matter how small you feel, you are enough." Tears burned at the corners of my eyes, but I didn't let them fall. I looked up, and for the first time that evening, I didn't bow my head. I met the stares around the table, daring them to see me not as a punchline, but as a daughter, as a fighter, as someone who didn't come from privilege, but from sacrifice. Danielle's gaze softened, a hint of respect flickering in his eyes. "That," he said firmly, "is legacy. That is dignity. And it's worth more than every brand label in this room combined." Gasps rippled again. But this time they weren't sharp with mockery. They were surprised, moved. The air itself seemed to shift, charged with something raw and human. Across the table, one of the older women, dripping in diamonds, lowered her eyes as though ashamed. Another guest, a man I'd seen boast about his sports car earlier, cleared his throat awkwardly, his smirk gone. For once, no one was laughing. The humiliation that had threatened to bury me moments ago had transformed. The dress that had been mocked as curtains was no longer a target. It was a story. A story no one in that ballroom had expected. A story that didn't fit into their world of labels and price tags, but one they couldn't dismiss. For the first time all night, I felt taller in my chair. My shoulders straightened, my chest loosened. My mother's voice echoed in me, steady and warm. "You are enough." But not everyone softened my story. He wasn't humbled by my mother's sacrifices or the weight of Daniel's words. No, he was sharpening his next weapon. But instead of softening, Chad only leaned forward, ready to twist the knife deeper. Just when I thought he might back down, he attacked harder. For a fleeting second, I let myself believe the room had shifted for good. Daniel's words had landed with authority. My story, my mother's sacrifice, had pierced through the noise. Faces that once sneered at me were now softened, uncertain, even ashamed. But Chad Whitmore was not the kind of man who yielded when confronted. He was the kind of man who tightened his grip, who doubled the force when he felt it slipping. His smirk returned, not playful this time, but razor sharp, a mask barely covering the venom in his eyes. "Well," he drawled, swirling the wine in his glass with deliberate ease, "that explains a lot." The tone was casual, but every word dripped with poison. The table tensed. I felt my stomach knot, the dread creeping back like a shadow after sunlight. Chad leaned forward, elbows resting on the linen, his gaze slicing into me. "Queens, right? That's where you're from?" He said it like it was filth, like he had just scraped something off the bottom of his shoe. No wonder. You can take the girl out of Queens, but you can't take Queens out of the girl. You walk into this ballroom thinking a sob story will polish you up. It doesn't. Not here. Not with us. The words landed like blows. Queens wasn't just a place to me. It was where I grew up, where my parents worked themselves raw so I could dream bigger. But in his mouth, it became a weapon, a stain, something to be ashamed of. The guests shifted uncomfortably, but none of them spoke. Their silence was deafening. Some lowered their eyes, others sipped their drinks, pretending to be distracted. Survival instincts. They had laughed when it was safe. Now they hid when it wasn't. I could feel my composure cracking. His words sank deep into the very insecurities I carried. I had spent years worrying I wasn't polished enough, that my accent slipped when I was nervous, that my shoes weren't expensive enough,
that everyone secretly thought I didn't belong, and here he was, dragging it all into the light. My chest tightened, my breath shattered.
Proof of his logic. This is reality, Daniel, and the reality is people like her will always be on the outside looking in. The words twisted deeper than the first blow. My throat burned. Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I clenched my jaw, refusing to let them fall. I couldn't give him that, not again. Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned forward slightly, his hands resting easily on the table, his voice carrying with deliberate calm. You're right about one thing, Chad. Reality does reveal people. And tonight, everyone here has seen yours. They've seen that your version of success comes from stepping on others, that your power depends on belittling people you know can't fight back. That's not strength, that's cowardice. The words struck hard. This time the silence wasn't cowardice, it was awe. The kind of silence that follows truth spoken out loud. I looked at Daniel, gratitude swelling in my chest, but also something else, confusion. His words carried more weight than simple defense. There was history in his tone, something unfinished. He wasn't just calling out Chad on my behalf. He was speaking like a man who had faced him before, who had been waiting for this confrontation. Chad's eyes narrowed. His smirk slipped entirely now, replaced by something harder, colder. He leaned back, but his jaw twitched, betraying the fury he tried to mask. And that's when I realized Daniel wasn't just defending me. He had his own unfinished war with Chad. Enemies never clash by accident. Their history always bleeds through. The air in the ballroom had shifted from uncomfortable to electric. Every guest caught between fear of Chad Whitmore and fascination with Daniel Blake. It was no longer about my dress, my background, or even me. It was about something larger, something I hadn't fully grasped yet. At first, I thought Daniel was only defending me, an act of decency from a man who refused to sit by while cruelty masqueraded as humor. But as I watched his steady gaze lock with Chad's venomous glare, as I listened to the sharp undercurrent in their words, I realized this wasn't just about me. This was personal. Chad leaned back in his chair, trying to mask his discomfort with forced nonchalance. He swirled the wine in his glass like a man still in control, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. Frowned, trying to piece it together. A deal? What deal? Daniel's jaw tightened, his voice low but steady. Boldness? Is that what you call it? I call it fraud. Manipulating numbers, coercing smaller firms into impossible agreements, burying the people who couldn't fight back. That wasn't boldness, Chad. It was predation. The table went dead silent. Utensils froze midair. Guests exchanged quick, nervous glances. I sat frozen, the words crashing into me like cold water. Fraud? Coercion? None of these were new to me in theory. I had seen enough whispers in corporate hallways to know how greed worked, but hearing them spoken aloud, in this room, at this table, was different. It was explosive. Chad's smile flickered, his mask cracking just slightly before snapping back into place. He leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. You never could stomach how the real world works, could you? Always clinging to your so-called ethics, like they could pay the bills or build an empire. You're not a businessman, Daniel. You're a glorified critic who couldn't keep up. Daniel didn't flinch. His composure was iron, his calm sharper than anger. And you're a parasite who calls corruption ambition. The only reason your empire still stands is because people are too afraid or too invested to name what they see. I felt my breath hitch. Empire. He said empire. Not company, not business. Empire. And the way Daniel said it, with such deliberate precision, told me it wasn't just a metaphor. There was something in Chad's empire, something rotten. Something dangerous. The guests weren't laughing anymore. They weren't sipping their wine casually or pretending to be distracted. They were listening, really listening. And the more they did, the more I realized how precarious Chad's control of the room had become. My mind spun. I had thought the evening's humiliation was about me, about my dress, my background, the story of my mother stitched into the fabric I wore.
But now I could see that I was only the spark. The real fire was this rivalry, this unfinished war between two powerful men, and somehow I was sitting at the very center of it. I wanted to shrink back, to retreat into silence, to make myself invisible again, but I couldn't.
Hit with the weight of prophecy. The guest shifted again, the unease building, the silence thickening like smoke in the air. I looked between the two men, my stomach twisting. This wasn't just about a single dinner, or even a single humiliation. This was about power, corruption, and the people who either thrived in its shadow or got crushed beneath it. And me? I had been dragged into the middle, my story now a weapon in their war. I wanted to ask Daniel what he meant, what truths he was hinting at, but the look in his eyes told me this wasn't the time. This wasn't just conversation, it was strategy, and every word was calculated. Chad's mask slipped further, his smile gone, his posture rigid. He set his glass down with a sharp clink that made the silverware tremble. "You're playing a dangerous game, Daniel. Careful what you reveal. Careful who you drag down with you." Daniel didn't look away. His calm was unnerving, almost unsettling, like a man who had already seen the end of the story and was just waiting for everyone else to catch up. And then he said it. His voice was steady, deliberate, every word cutting through the air with the weight of truth. "Because the cracks in your empire, Chad, are already showing. And tonight, I'm going to name one of them." The room froze. Every head turned. Every breath held. My pulse hammered in my chest. I knew whatever he was about to say would change everything. Not just for Chad, but for me. For everyone at that table. And then Daniel revealed something about Chad's empire that made the entire table go silent. The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Daniel Blake's voice did not waver. He didn't raise it, didn't pound the table or let anger sharpen the edges. Instead, his tone was calm, deliberate, and far more dangerous than shouting could ever be. Calm words land like stones when spoken at the right time, and his landed with brutal precision. "Your empire, Chad," Daniel said, his gaze fixed firmly on the man at the head of the table, "wasn't built on brilliance. It wasn't built on leadership. It was built on fraud, on lies, on exploiting people who trusted you." The air drained from the ballroom in an instant. It was as though the chandeliers stopped humming. The silverware froze mid-clink, and even the waiters moving silently along, dripping with mockery. "Daniel, really, this is beneath you." But the laugh didn't catch on. No one else joined him. Even those who had clung to his charm earlier in the evening remained silent now, their smiles stiff, their hands fidgeting in their laps. Daniel leaned forward slightly, never breaking eye contact. "Call it beneath me if you like, but the truth doesn't need my approval to exist. You've falsified valuations. You've bullied smaller firms into contracts they couldn't survive. You've bled them dry and then called it boldness. But boldness without integrity isn't strength, Chad. It's rot." The word rot echoed, sinking into the thick silence. My chest tightened as I sat frozen at the edge of it all. A part of me wanted to look away, to disappear, to let the fire burn without me near it. But I couldn't. I was caught in the middle, torn between two feelings I had never carried at once, fear and hope. Fear because I knew Chad would not let this humiliation pass without retaliation, and I could already feel his eyes sharpening toward me. Hope because, for the first time, someone powerful enough to be heard had spoken the truth aloud. It was terrifying. It was exhilarating. It was both at once. Chad's jaw ticked, his smirk faltering even as he tried to hold on to it. He reached for his glass, swirling the wine with exaggerated calm, but his grip was tighter than before. "These are dangerous accusations," he said, his tone icy now. "But of course, Daniel has always loved painting himself as a moral compass, the man who stands above the rest, pointing fingers at the ones actually building something." A murmur of unease rippled through the table. Chad's words carried weight, but they no longer fell like commands. They fell like desperate attempts at control. Daniel didn't flinch. "Building something," he repeated softly, and the calm in his tone carried more threat than any shout could.
What you've built is a house of cards, and one by one, it's starting to fall. Gasps again. Someone shifted uncomfortably. Another set down their fork, suddenly uninterested in the filet mignon cooling on the plate. I pressed my hands into my lap, willing myself not to tremble. Every part of me wanted to shrink away from the
like Chad Whitmore, because when they sense power slipping, they don't surrender. They lash out. His eyes slid from Daniel to me, cold, calculating, searching for a way to wound, to deflect, to regain what he had lost. And when his smirk returned, it was different now, not the arrogant smile of a man in control, but the venomous grin of one ready to destroy whatever he must to survive. He raised his glass slightly, angling it toward me as though I were the centerpiece in his cruel performance. "Since we're exposing truths," he said, his voice sharper now, every word dripping with poison, "let's talk about her." My breath caught. The entire table turned toward me, their gazes heavy, curious, waiting for whatever strike he was about to deliver. My hands clenched in my lap, my body frozen in place. Chad's smile widened, vicious, hungry. "Because if anyone here believes her little sob story about a handmade dress makes her a symbol of strength, you're mistaken. She doesn't belong at this table, and I can prove it." The words hit me like ice water poured straight into my chest. My pulse thundered, my throat tightened, and every instinct screamed at me to run. And in that moment, I knew this wasn't over. Daniel had exposed him, but Chad wasn't finished. If he couldn't silence Daniel, he would destroy me. But Chad wasn't done humiliating me. He had one more weapon up his sleeve. The worst betrayal is the one you never saw coming. The moment Chad turned the spotlight back onto me, I felt the walls closing in. His venomous words dripped across the table, and I could feel the weight of every gaze pressing against my skin. My humiliation was no longer private. It was about to become his weapon of mass destruction. I braced myself for the blow, but I wasn't prepared for where it came from. It didn't come from Chad, not at first. It came from Ava. Ava Martinez had been my closest ally in the company. We'd started together as interns, huddled over late-night projects, whispering our frustrations in break rooms, celebrating each tiny victory like it was a triumph against a machine designed to crush us. If there was anyone I thought I could trust at that table, it was her. She knew my story. Permission to laugh again, but this time at me. I froze. My mouth went dry, my heart plummeted. Of all the people in that room, I hadn't expected the knife to come from her hand. Ava, my friend, my confidant, the one who knew what it cost me to stand here. And yet there she was, aligning herself with Chad to save her own place at the table. My chest tightened and my vision blurred at the edges. It wasn't just humiliation anymore, it was abandonment. A loneliness so sharp it hollowed me out from the inside. Chad's grin widened, feeding on the betrayal. "See?" he said smoothly, gesturing toward Ava like she was his star witness. "Even your own friends know you don't belong. Even they see through the act." The laughter returned, not booming this time, not cruel like before, but soft, nervous, poisonous in its subtlety. It was enough. Enough to unravel me completely. I looked at Ava, searching her face for some sign of regret, some flicker of the friend I thought I knew. But she didn't meet my eyes. She kept her gaze fixed on her wine glass, her shoulders tense, her jaw tight. She had made her choice. And in that moment, something inside me broke. I felt the tears threatening to spill, but I forced them back, blinking furiously. My hands trembled in my lap, gripping the fabric of my mother's dress so tightly I thought the stitches might tear. My throat burned, every word I wanted to say choking me into silence. Daniel shifted beside me, his voice calm but firm, trying to steady the ground beneath me. "This isn't about dramatics. This is about dignity, and those who mock it reveal more about themselves than about the person they target.
But his words, powerful as they were, couldn't stitch the wound Ava had left. Because betrayal doesn't echo like cruelty, it sinks. It lingers. It whispers in your own voice, telling you that if even your friends don't believe in you, then maybe you don't deserve to believe in yourself. I sat there, fighting back tears, but the weight of isolation pressed harder with every second. Every whisper, every sidelong glance, every polite laugh stabbed like a reminder that I was alone. And in that pit of despair, my defenses crumbled. I don't for everyone to hear. I wasn't raised on privilege or polished for nights like this. My mother worked in a sewing shop until her hands bled. My father drove a delivery truck until his back gave out. We barely scraped by, paycheck to paycheck. Some weeks, we didn't even have that. The air in the room shifted immediately. No one spoke. Forks froze in midair. Glasses hovered without being sipped. I felt their eyes on me, heavy, curious, stunned. I swallowed hard, the knot in my throat burning. This dress? I brushed my trembling fingers against the neckline, tracing the stitches my mother had made with love and sacrifice. It isn't from a designer rack. It isn't a luxury label. My mother sewed it herself. She wore it to her first job interview in this country, believing it carried her courage. And when she died, she left it to me. Every time I wear it, I carry her strength, her fight, her belief in me. My voice cracked, but I kept going, because once the dam had broken, there was no stopping it. I studied under streetlights when the power was cut off. I wore hand-me-down shoes until they fell apart. I clawed my way into this company, into this room, because I refused to give up. Nothing about me was destined for this life, except work and grit. The silence that followed was suffocating, but it wasn't cruel. It was different. It was reverent, heavy. I glanced around the table, bracing for smirks, waiting for laughter. But instead, I saw something I hadn't expected. Shame. A woman across the table dabbed at her eyes with her napkin. A man shifted uncomfortably, his expression strained, as though the weight of my words had peeled away his own pretenses. For the first time that night, the power in the room shifted, not away from me, not toward Chad, but into the truth itself. And Chad hated it. His smirk twisted, sharper now, desperate. He leaned back, forcing a laugh that rang hollow. So there it is, the sob story. I knew it had to come eventually. People like you always cling to your struggles like they make you special. But this isn't a charity gala. This is business. Struggle doesn't close deals. Sentiment doesn't win power. The words stung, sharp and humiliating. Story people remember. That's the kind of strength money can't fake. The words struck like lightning. Heads nodded slowly, almost involuntarily. A ripple of murmurs spread, softer than before but unmistakable. Agreement, recognition, respect. For the first time, I felt my shame transform into something else, something almost unrecognizable. Pride. My story wasn't a weakness. It was my strength. My mother's stitches weren't scraps, they were a legacy. I sat taller, though my hands still trembled. My humiliation hadn't destroyed me, it had revealed me. Chad's jaw tightened, his composure slipping. He tried to force another laugh, but it came out brittle, desperate. "Don't let him romanticize this," he snapped, pointing at me like I was an object instead of a person. "She's not a hero. She's just another outsider pretending she belongs. She'll never be one of us." But the words didn't carry the weight they once had. Not after my confession. Not after Daniel's defense. The room wasn't with him anymore. My heart pounded in my chest, but for the first time that night, it wasn't fear driving it. It was clarity. I met Chad's glare, and I didn't look away. I had spent years trying to blend in, to shrink myself enough to fit the mold of this world. But maybe I was never supposed to blend. Maybe I was supposed to stand out. The silence that followed was thick with tension, the kind that makes you lean in instead of pulling back. And then Daniel turned to me. His eyes met mine, steady and certain, and his voice softened, not for the room but for me. "You've proven more tonight than most people here will in their entire careers," he said. "And if you're ready, Emily,
I can offer you something that will change everything. The air seemed to crackle, alive with suspense. I froze, my breath catching in my throat because I knew whatever came next wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about rewriting my future. And then Daniel turned to me and offered something that would change everything. He wasn't just defending me. He was offering me a way out. When Daniel turned to me, the room stilled in a way I had never experienced before. It wasn't just the hush of polite curiosity. It was the silence of people sensing history was about to shift. His eyes were steady, calm, reassessing me, reassessing Daniel, reassessing Chad. The balance of power had tilted, and everyone could feel it. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his tone softening as his words seemed to land directly on me, bypassing the rest of the table. Emily, you deserve better than to sit under the shadow of a man who diminishes you. You deserve a place where your value isn't questioned, but celebrated. If you're ready, I can give you that place. Not as a handout, not as pity, but as recognition of who you are and what you've already proven tonight. The air seemed to thicken around me. My breath caught, my pulse pounding against my ribs. He wasn't just defending me anymore. He was offering me something more dangerous, more intoxicating. Freedom. Gasps whispered down the table. Guests exchanged glances, their faces etched with curiosity, intrigue, even envy. Daniel Blake, the man whose name was etched into the walls of luxury, whose influence stretched further than Chad's empire could ever hope to, was offering me an escape route, an opportunity, a door to a future I had never dared imagine. But opportunity in rooms like this was never simple, because even as I felt the warmth of Daniel's words lift me, I felt the cold steel of fear press against my chest. Taking his offer meant defying Chad. It meant burning the bridge I had spent years crawling across, inch by inch, just to be here tonight. My job wasn't just a paycheck. It was the scaffolding that held my life together. To lose it would mean risking everything I had built, everything my mother had sacrificed for me to achieve. I looked around the table and I could see the judgment in their eyes. Some admired Daniel's audacity. Others recoiled, sensing the shift in loyalty and the danger it carried. And Chad. Chad's face was a mask barely holding back the rage brewing underneath. His jaw clenched, his fingers tightened around his glass, his knuckles pale. He looked like a man watching his empire slip through his hands one grain of sand at a time. The silence stretched. The choice sat in front of me like a precipice, daring me to leap. Part of me wanted to say yes, to throw myself into Daniel's promise, to free myself from the chains of Chad's control. But another part, the part conditioned to survive in rooms like this, whispered caution. What if Daniel's offer was genuine but fleeting? Glasses rattled. Silverware jumped. A collective gasp escaped the guests, and heads turned instantly toward him. Chad's face was flushed red, his mask of composure torn away, replaced by raw fury. His voice cut through the room, low and venomous, every syllable soaked in threat. "You even think about saying yes," he hissed, his eyes locked on mine. "And I will make sure you never work in this industry again." The blood in my veins turned to ice. The chill of his words pierced deeper than any mockery, sharper than any insult. This wasn't cruelty for show. This was a promise. A threat delivered in front of an entire room of witnesses. Gasps echoed again, but no one spoke. Some lowered their eyes to their plates, pretending not to have heard. Others stared, wide-eyed, horrified, but silent. My breath caught in my throat, fear clawing at me, suffocating me. Chad wasn't bluffing. I knew it in my bones. He had the power, the connections, the influence to make good on every word. One phone call, one whisper, and my career would be ashes before it even had the chance to rise. I had gone from humiliation to hope, and now, in an instant, I was staring down the barrel of destruction. But before I could answer, Chad slammed his hand on the table and threatened me in a way that chilled my blood. His words weren't just humiliating, they were dangerous. The sound of Chad's palm slamming against the polished mahogany table still echoed in my ears, a violent punctuation mark that silenced everything else. Wine glasses quivered, forks clattered, and the guests sat frozen, unsure whether to breathe or shrink further into their chairs. But none of them dared interrupt. His eyes were locked on me, sharp as glass shards. Every trace of his earlier smugness had drained away, replaced by something darker, more primal. This wasn't a joke anymore. This wasn't about appearances or pride. This was about destruction. "You even think of taking his offer," Chad hissed, his voice sharp but low enough to make me feel like it was meant only for me, though everyone heard. "And I will end you. I'll make sure no one in this industry ever touches your name again. Every opportunity you think you..."
Clawed my way forward, believing that if I just endured enough, worked hard enough, stayed silent enough, one day it would all be worth it. But now, in a single moment, Chad threatened to erase it all. The guests around us sat frozen, their faces pale with unease. Some glanced at me with pity, others at Chad with barely disguised disgust. But no one spoke. Their silence was louder than his words, a damning reflection of how power worked in rooms like this. They all heard him abuse it, but none dared challenge him. Not yet. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak either. His eyes met mine briefly, steady, protective. But this wasn't his moment to answer. It was mine. And yet I couldn't move. Fear anchored me to my seat, wrapping around my ribs like chains. Chad leaned back slightly, his smirk returning. Not playful this time, but cruel, confident, satisfied. He believed he had me cornered. He believed his threat had silenced me, broken me, proven once again that no matter how high I climbed, I would always be his to control. But somewhere inside the trembling, inside the suffocating fear, something else stirred. A flicker, a spark. For the first time, I wasn't just terrified of losing my career. I was furious at the way he could dangle it over me like a leash. My entire life, fear had been my compass, steering me through survival. But what if fear had never been protection at all? What if it had only ever been the cage he built around me? The thought terrified me, but it also electrified me. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breath. My hands shook beneath the table, but I forced myself not to drop my gaze. I met his eyes, even as my stomach churned. And in that fragile defiance, I saw something flicker in him, just for a second. Doubt. But the silence around us was suffocating. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The entire room was waiting, suspended between Chad's cruelty and my response, wondering if I would fold or fight. And then I realized the silence itself was part of his weapon. If no one else spoke, then his voice was the only truth that mattered. If I didn't challenge it, his threat would become fact. I opened my evening. Chad's control wavered. Not because of me, not because of Daniel, but because another voice had entered the battlefield. And just when I thought I had to face him alone, another voice rose from the table. One by one, the others began to turn against him. For so long, Chad's word had been law at every table he touched. People laughed when he laughed, nodded when he spoke, and looked away when he tore someone else down. That night, when he threatened to ruin me, I thought the silence meant they would let him win again. But silence doesn't last forever, not when truth has already cracked the mask. The first voice came quietly, almost hesitant, from the far end of the table. A man who had spent the evening mostly invisible cleared his throat, his hands folded on the linen in front of him. "Richard," he said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I think you've crossed a line tonight." The words seemed to hang in the air, fragile, like glass that could shatter at the faintest touch. My heart pounded in my chest. I turned toward him, stunned. He wasn't a rival. He wasn't Daniel. He was one of Chad's usual supporters, the kind of man who smiled through every cruel joke because it was safer. And yet, here he was, breaking formation. Chad let out a laugh, sharp and dismissive. "A line? Come on. You know me better than that. I was just making a point. Everyone here understands." But the man didn't back down. His shoulders straightened, his gaze steady. "No," he said,
his voice firmer now. "We don't. Not this time." The shift was subtle, but undeniable. Guests who had kept their eyes glued to their plates now began to glance at each other. Some leaned back. Others tilted their heads as though they were finally giving themselves permission to see Chad clearly. And then a woman, seated 2 chairs from him, set down her glass with a sharp clink. "He's right," she said. Her voice trembled slightly, but the steel beneath it carried through. It wasn't a joke. It was cruel, and frankly, I regret laughing earlier. A ripple moved across the table. Heads turned, expressions shifted. For the first time, Chad looked rattled. I sat frozen, breath caught in my throat, as courage spread. Were finding theirs. For years, I had thought I was the only one who felt small under his shadow, the only one forced into silence. But now I was watching silence break, piece by piece, until the weight began to lift. Still, the room was fragile, balanced on a knife's edge. One misstep and they could all retreat again. One show of dominance from Chad and the chain reaction could crumble. Chad tried to seize it. He leaned forward, his voice booming with forced confidence. "Let's not rewrite history here. You've all benefited from my leadership. You've all thrived because of the tables I've invited you to sit at. Don't forget who gave you those opportunities." It was the kind of line that once would have worked. Once they would have nodded along, grateful for his supposed generosity. But tonight, the spell was broken. An older gentleman, one of Chad's longest business partners, shook his head slowly. "Respect doesn't come from handouts, Richard. It comes from how you treat people. And tonight, you've lost mine." The words landed with the force of a gavel. My skin prickled. My breath hitched. Around the table I could see it, the undeniable shift. The air itself seemed lighter, as though everyone had finally exhaled after holding their breath for years. Chad's face reddened, his jaw tight, his hands trembling against the stem of his glass. He opened his mouth, ready to lash out again, but the voices were no longer his to silence. One by one, they kept coming. Small affirmations, gentle corrections, bold declarations. The collective weight of their words was something I had never seen before. A room that had once felt like his kingdom now felt like a jury, and he was the one on trial. I sat quietly, almost afraid to move, as the tide turned in real time. My humiliation no longer defined the night. His cruelty did. For the first time since the dinner began, I felt less alone, less small, less silenced. The courage spreading through the room wasn't just theirs. It was mine, too. And as I looked at Chad, I realized something that sent a chill down my spine. He realized it, too. His eyes darted back to me, wild, desperate. He knew
Final blow. What he revealed would end Chad's reign forever. The scrape of the chair silenced the entire ballroom. Every fork paused midair. Every breath seemed suspended, as if the very air leaned closer to listen. The man who rose wasn't just another guest. He was the kind of presence that shifted tides. His name was Charles Whitmore, a titan in finance, a man whose handshake alone had decided the fate of corporations. Even Chad, for all his arrogance, paled slightly at his rise. Whitmore adjusted his jacket with deliberate calm, his gaze steady as he scanned the table. His voice, when it came, was low, controlled, but it carried the weight of a gavel. "Richard," he said, addressing Chad by his full name, "I have tolerated your antics for far too long, but tonight I won't stand silent." Chad straightened in his chair, forcing a smirk. "Charles, come now. You're not buying into Daniel's little performance, are you? You know me better than that." But Whitmore wasn't swayed. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a slim leather folder. The room collectively inhaled, their eyes locked on the object in his hand. He placed it on the table with a soft but final thud. "These aren't performances, Richard.
Whitmore said. "These are facts." He opened the folder and began to slide documents across the table, pages filled with financial records, contracts, evidence of transactions that glowed like red flags under the dim light of the chandeliers. "For months, I have had investigators reviewing your acquisitions. What they found was worse than even I expected." The guests leaned in, eyes widening, jaws tightening. I craned forward too, my breath catching as I glimpsed bold black numbers and signatures, records of inflated valuations, forged documents, fraudulent schemes hidden behind layers of polished charm. The whispers started instantly, louder now, urgent. A woman gasped audibly, covering her mouth. A man swore under his breath. The empire Chad had boasted of all night was unraveling before our eyes, thread by thread, each document another nail in the coffin of his reputation. Chad's smirk faltered. He grabbed at one of the papers. Heart pounded in my chest as I watched it unfold. For the first time since the night began, I felt the heavy scent of justice in the air. It was close, closer than I had ever dared to believe. The man who had humiliated me, mocked my past, threatened my future, was finally facing the weight of his own corruption. But justice, I realized, wasn't always clean. It wasn't always neat. And men like Chad didn't go down without dragging others into the fire. He shoved back his chair abruptly, the legs screeching against the polished floor. His face was red, his hands trembling, not with fear, but with fury. "You think you've won?" he spat, his voice shaking the silence. "You think one folder of papers and a room full of cowards changes who I am? I built this world. I made all of you, and if I fall, I'll take every single one of you with me." Gasps erupted. A few guests recoiled, while others stiffened, their eyes darting nervously as if to gauge whether his threat carried teeth. But then his gaze snapped to me, and the room blurred into shadows around him. His voice dropped, low and venomous, each word dripping with intent. "And you," he hissed, pointing a trembling finger in my direction, "you think you've escaped me? That because they pity you, because Blake props you up, you're untouchable now? No. You're mine to destroy. If I go down tonight, I swear, you'll burn with me." The blood drained from my face. My heart stopped cold. Justice may have been closing in, but so was retaliation, sharp and merciless. But Chad wasn't going down without dragging me into the fire. Cornered men can be dangerous, and he was no exception. The evidence Whitmore laid across the table had stripped Chad of his armor, but it hadn't stripped him of his rage. Rage doesn't die quietly. It thrashes. It claws. It looks for someone weaker to consume. And that someone was me. He stood, trembling with fury, his face red, his jaw tight. Every trace of charm had dissolved, leaving only the raw venom of a man unmasked. His eyes bored into me as though everyone else in the room had disappeared, looked down in unwilling to meet. But Chad pressed on, feeding on the silence, feeding on the way I faltered. "You don't belong here," he snarled. "You never did. Without me, you're nothing. You'll crawl back to Queens, back to the gutter you came from, and that's where you'll stay." The ballroom spun. His words rang in my ears, sharper than the clinking crystal and murmuring voices. I felt myself shrinking again, folding inward, the way I always had when confronted with power I couldn't fight. My fingers curled against the fabric of my dress, clinging to it like a lifeline, to the stitches my mother had made, to the reminder that her strength still lived inside me. But doubt suffocated me. What if he was right? What if all I had built could be erased with a single word from him? What if, beneath the resilience, beneath the grit, I really was just the girl who didn't belong? Then Daniel's voice cut through the fog. "Emily,
Just my name. Simple. Steady. A lifeline tossed into the storm. I turned, my vision blurred with unshed tears, and met his gaze. His eyes weren't pitying. They weren't soft with sympathy or sharp with judgment. They were steady, strong, unyielding. You don't have to let him define you, he said, his tone calm but firm enough to carry across the table. He thrives on your silence. He survives on your fear. But tonight, you've already shown more courage than he's ever known. Speak. Take it from him. The words hit me like an electric current. My pulse thundered in my chest. My fear didn't vanish, but it shifted. It became fuel, raw and sharp. I looked back at Chad, and for the first time, I didn't see a giant towering over me. I saw a man unraveling. A man who needed me small to keep himself large. A man whose power depended entirely on my silence. And I was done being silent. My breath trembled as I opened my mouth. The room leaned in, waiting. My heart pounded. My knees shook beneath the table. But I forced the words out anyway. And when I finally spoke,
Not on vision, but on fear. You humiliated me tonight to protect your ego, to cover the cracks already forming in your foundation. But you were wrong about me, Chad. I don't need you to belong. I never did. Gasps broke through the room. Some guests leaned forward, riveted. Others nodded faintly as though they, too, were finding their voices through mine. Chad tried to interrupt, his voice sharp and cutting, but I raised my hand. For the first time, he stopped. Not because he respected me, but because the room did, and his power crumbled in the silence of their disapproval. You said I'd crawl back to the gutter, I continued, my words gaining strength with every syllable. But what you don't understand is that crawling taught me how to climb. I didn't come from privilege. I came from sacrifice, from resilience, from nights spent studying under streetlights because we couldn't afford electricity. And that's why I'll never fear men like you again. Because you can't take from me what you never gave me. The applause didn't come in a roar. It came in fragments. A single clap, hesitant at first, then another, then a chorus building until the entire table joined in. Some guests even stood, their eyes shining, their voices rising in agreement. Chad's face drained of color. His empire had been publicly exposed by Whitmore's documents, but it was my words that sealed his downfall. The room had turned. His allies evaporated, his support system crumbled, and all that remained was the bitter taste of defeat. He stumbled back into his chair, his hands trembling, his smirk gone. For the first time, he looked smaller than the rest of us, diminished not by scandal alone, but by the truth he could no longer silence. Daniel stepped forward, his presence steady beside me. "This is what leadership looks like," he said firmly, his words ringing out like a final verdict. Not control, not fear. Courage, integrity. That's what we should be celebrating at this table. The guests nodded, murmured, even smiled, toward me, not him. In that moment, I felt something I had never experienced before in this world of glass and gold. Belonging, not because I had blended in, but because I had dared to stand tall. Chad sat slumped, silent, stripped of his power, his certain. I was no longer afraid, because I had faced the man who thrived on my silence, and I had spoken. And so I leave you with this. When someone tries to silence you, will you let them? Or will you finally stand tall? What would you have done if you were in Emily's place? Stay silent or stand tall? Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your perspective. If this story inspired you, don't forget to hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories, because your support is what keeps these stories alive.